everybody, welcome back to Uptime. We have a great show for this week. We're going to talk about floating solar and why Rosemary does not like floating solar. And then we're going to look at floating wind that is powering oil and gas rigs off the coast of Norway, which Rosemary, again, doesn't like. But then we're going to talk about something Rosemary really doesn't like, which is Toyota making hydrogen capsules you can take home and power your microwave with. And then we'll have a guest interview with Nicholas Gaudern, CTO of PowerCurve, where we'll discuss the next generation of Vortex generators. So stay tuned. We'll be back after the music. German energy firm RWE is investing in a pilot project centered around the deployment of a floating solar technology up in the North Sea. And they're calling it a floating solar park. And it's going to be installed off the waters off of the coast of Belgium. It's going to be a 0.5 megawatt peak plant. And the company that's developing this floating solar system, I guess the solar system, does that sound right? That sounds odd. This company is named SolarDuck, and it's a floating platform. So Rosemary, if you haven't seen this, it's a triangular set of solar panels on 3 legs that float above the surface of the ocean, and they connect together kind of like Legos in a sense. They kind of click together. So it's a floating, moving platform with a bunch of floats on it, and then they anchor it to the ocean floor on the corners. So you got this big triangular floating. I guess they can make it into different shapes, I suppose. You got this big floating thing out in the ocean that is collecting solar energy. So the goal of SolarDuck is to use this demonstration to show that they can do this on a grander scale. And I guess other companies are doing it. There's an energy firm, the Portuguese energy firm EDP, is opening a 5 megawatt floating solar park. So there's more than one company doing this. SolarDuck is based in the Netherlands. At least that's what they show up on Google. They may be based in other places, but that's what it shows them for. But Rosemary, does this make any sense? Do we need floating solar?
I actually just recently put floating solar on my list of things that I have to cover because I have never seen the point, but there are enough projects like this, enough serious money going into them that I feel like I have to engage more. I think it's just because, especially for offshore, I can understand it in hydro reservoirs. That makes more sense to me because, one, it's a much less harsh operating environment. 2, it saves a bunch of existing problems with the hydro or pumped hydro. So, it'll reduce evaporation. You've already got the connections there, right. Electrical connections there, and you've already got maintenance crews that are going to be going out there. And I can see that, you get a bit better efficiency from a solar panel if you've got it on water, then it's being cooled. And something that I covered with, I think Glenn Ryan's been on this show too, but I went and had a look at his Sunovate system, which is all about cooling solar panels to get better efficiency out of them. And it can make quite a difference. So you can get something out of it there. And then the other benefit would be that you're not taking up land in places that are land constrained. So I guess that's one kind of benefit that doesn't sound so valuable to me because we've got heaps of land around in Australia just waiting to put solar panels on, whether it's on people's roofs or, just in areas. You can combine it with agriculture, agrivoltaics. So there's some benefits, but putting them offshore, just having this flexible, constantly moving electrical connections offshore, salty environment, it just sounds horrible, horrible to maintain, just absolutely horrible. And so to me, it always looked like way more trouble than it's worth. Just put them on land or, on some fresh water where you need a solution to evaporation. Yeah. But like I said, so many of these projects are popping up that I feel like maybe the economics has changed and I need to revisit and reassess my my interpretation of all the trade-offs involved.
I can see some advantages in the on the development side. simply because as we move forward into wanting to make the actual energy transition more green in marketing, we also want it to actually be more green, right? So when you do an onshore like utility scale photovoltaic park, a solar park, there's when you look at these things, there's 10 pile drivers out there. There's a half a dozen D7 to D10 big dozers burning diesel fuel, scaring up the earth, and it takes a long time to install these things. You might be a 6 month project to install a large scale one. So if you can build these things quayside in a facility that exists and then dump them in the water and go out, that might be more or how do you say, like, I guess less carbon intensive to build them in the development stage. Uh, but on the other side of this one here, offshore, I, I'm with you, Rosemary. I don't see any way this thing survives. When they talk about going, if you're saying in a pumped hydro reservoir, that's one thing. You might get 2, 3, 4 foot waves in that. You're offshore in the North Sea. I mean, you can have 20-meter rollers coming through like that. There's nothing that can survive that.
Yeah, not to mention the salt water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So does the system make sense from a political standpoint because it's not seen? That's, I think, what we're seeing a big push for offshore wind in the United States is that gets it off the land. So there's less complaints from my local constituents. I don't have to hear them complaining about the wind turbine in their backyard. So there's a big push for offshore wind in the States. Does solar have to deal with that same thing? Like, where are you going to put solar in New York City? You're going to put it offshore. Where are you going to put it in New Jersey? Where are you going to put it in North Carolina? Where are you going to put it in South Carolina? Right? So does it then lend itself politically to be an easier solution where I don't have to go find these places on land to develop? I just stick it out in the ocean. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's the only part of it that makes sense.
Yeah.
I know we talked about years ago. No, not years ago. How long have we been doing this podcast? Like 2 years. Maybe it was a year ago. We were talking about the electricity in the cables on offshore affecting animals, little sea creatures. The brown crab, if I remember right, off the coast of the UK, would get confused.
Yeah, the magnetic field. Yeah.
It confuses them as to where to go. They just kind of just stop moving. Are we going to do something similar to with these floating platforms? Are sharks going to be attracted? Is a whale going to come up and bump into them? Did you see that picture of the whale jumping on that boat the other day? I think that was in the United States where the whale just flopped onto this boat, I think off the coast of New York. Yeah, like, what? There's just so many weird things can happen in the ocean. I'm sort of with Joel here where I think of the North Sea as being this really scary, terrible place when the weather gets nasty. I don't know what lives out there. It's hard. I assume they lose boats out there all the time. How are they not going to have difficulty with solar panels? Maybe they don't.
Yeah, well, I think that there are a few of these offshore floating solar projects or pilot projects that have been installed around the world. So at least soon we should have information about what the maintenance is like in reality. Because at the moment, I think most people talking about it are just, doing thought experiments, imagining what it's going to be like.
Right.
So, yeah, I think this is really one of those things where you need to just put it out there and see what happens.
I was just thinking it makes sense that RWE is doing it then, because you would almost you would have to self-insure it. So there has to be someone doing it that has the amount of capital that if something went wrong, they would eat it, right? Like no insurance company is going to pick up the insurance on one of these right now.
Yeah, if we can't insure wind turbines for lightning, we have a hard time with solar panels out on the ocean, I think. But recently you saw that Hawaii is just in the process of shutting down. I think it's its last coal plant. They're taking the last couple of deliveries of coal to the islands of Hawaii, and they're really concerned about that because it's a significant producer of electricity for the island. Maybe floating solar makes sense in some place like Hawaii. Maybe that's a solution. I know they have bad weather there too, but I think there are a lot of island nations where Puerto Rico, Haiti, where this may make a lot of sense because it's sort of, you just drag it in and connect it.
I think it will all depend on land availability for onshore solar. I'd be really surprised if offshore solar ever competes with onshore solar where it's possible to put it in. I know it's a little bit more efficient because it's cooled. But other than that, it's all downsides, and some, big downsides. And in fact, if you go on the Solar Duck website, land scarcity is the only the only point that they raise about why you need to put solar panels offshore. So I'm imagining that it could make sense for places like really densely populated islands, like Japan, Singapore, places like that. Maybe they can get a little bit more energy security, a little bit more domestic energy if they go for floating solar in addition to the floating wind, or I guess any kind of offshore wind.
A few years ago, out in California, they were in some of their water reservoirs. They were dumping truckloads of these black plastic balls, and the black plastic balls were dumped into these reservoirs to combat evaporation of the water. Right. So maybe this is a solution that can help places like that as well. And that, this, of course, is not onshore. Or not offshore. This is onshore. But it's going back to the same thing Rosemary said. If it's in a pumped hydro facility or something of that sort, then I think it makes sense to do that. And you're not going to have the wild weather and things. So you have that little bit of cooling. You're maybe saving some evaporation in the water supply. So I like that idea, but I just don't know about the North Sea.
I think that one place where offshore does make sense, and Alan, you're going to be surprised to hear me say this, but for offshore oil and gas projects, I think that I know that they do need remote renewable electricity. And you might say, oh, well, we're in an energy transition. There won't be any fossil fuel extraction in 20, 30 years. But if you look at that net zero roadmaps, from the IEA, for example, there is still a bunch of fossil fuels. And a large chunk of it is not for burning. It's for, making stuff like plastics, for example, which, we're probably still going to need in 2050. And then there's some hard to abate sectors that are, going to have to be, applications where we still will be burning fossil fuels and then offsetting the emissions. But there's a lot of energy needed for processing. And at the moment, they're burning gas or some other fossil fuel to get that energy. And I know that plenty of these oil and gas companies are looking to, to decarbonize at least that part of their emissions. And it's really easy to just kind of get really cynical about these companies and, just call it all greenwashing. But the reality is that we do need these industries that, or at least these industries are highly likely to still exist in a net zero world. And so they also need to be cleaned up. And it might not be, a huge part of the energy transition, but there are going to need to be offshore renewable generation and energy storage are going to be some, big, large niches, I think, for applications. So, I would suggest that would be a good starting place for a tech like this, because those companies have enough money to to deal with a pilot project that ends up costing more than they expected, needing more maintenance than they expected.
Yeah. So just two pieces of this, and this is a good bridge to the next segment. We get a lot of comments on YouTube from people who are saying, well, wind turbines have petroleum products. When the wind turbine fell over in Sweden last week, they dumped a bunch of oil into the landscape. Yeah, everybody realizes that there's petroleum in wind. Everybody realizes there's petroleum making solar cells. Everybody gets that. It gets us the question of, and Rosemary and I and Joel are not saying we're going to eliminate oil. I don't think that's the question at all. The question is, how do you find a good balance here, everybody? And to assume engineers are hardliners in anything, I think is a wrong move. Engineers are probably the most common sense, level-headed people you're ever going to run across. We're trying to find solutions for everybody, right? We're trying to help the environment, provide electricity, keep the lights on, make sure you have a car to drive to work, those kind of things. There's a very hard line. It's like there's only two levels here. Either you're for petroleum and you're trying to destroy the earth, or you're against petroleum and you're an environmental nut job. There's it's just weird right now. And maybe it's the Twitterization of the world, but it just sucks, because you like to be able to have real discussions with people about what your future is likely to be, and we're missing those discussions, and instead it becomes political, and That's one thing that we're not on this show. We're just not trying to become political.
Get the latest on wind industry news, business, and technology sent straight to you every week. Sign up for the Uptime Tech newsletter at weatherguardwind.com/news.
Equinor is developing wind turbines, floating wind turbines, which is actually the largest offshore floating wind farm off the coast of Norway. And it's going to power, of all things, oil and gas rigs out in the ocean. And so this project is about a 100 megawatt project, about $500,000 for the whole thing. And it's going to keep these oil and gas fields with electricity. It's going to provide about a third of their annual power needs. So they're putting out Siemens Gamesa 8.6 megawatt machines, which are pretty good size machines. And they're installed on floating concrete structures. And I didn't understand this. Floating concrete doesn't float to me. But it's on floating concrete structures that are sort of interconnected and share an anchoring system. And it's supposed to start producing power in a couple of weeks. Now, again, going back to your point, Rosemary, oil and gas rigs use a lot of energy. If we can do it more cleanly than they are in the past, that's awesome. But there's a big pushback against this, saying, well, why are you helping these oil and gas rigs off the coast of Norway? Don't the Norwegians know you can't use oil and gas? Why are we helping them? And I think what are your 2 cents on that?
I do have 2 cents on this, on the Norwegians. And I have to start by saying that Norway is literally my favorite country to travel to. It's beautiful. All of my best holidays I've ever had in my life have all been in Norway, up north, doing ski tours or surfing or anything. It's incredibly beautiful. However, I do find that Norwegians are quite smug about their energy transition and how far they've progressed for people who have funded it entirely through fossil fuel money. And one time I was in there's this beautiful archipelago called the Lofoten Peninsula. It's a series of islands where the mountains just go straight down to the ocean. Did a ski trip there, and we always planned to go back to do a surf trip, but didn't make it. And while I was there, they had just announced that they were not going to explore any more fossil fuel resources in the Lofoten Archipelago because it's such a beautiful natural area. And simultaneously, Equinor is attempting to start this big project in the Great Australian Bight, which is a very beautiful Australian area. And just the hypocrisy of it to me was like too much to handle. That, yeah, okay, we're so environmental in Norway, but they do continue to expand their operation. And that's the reason why they have been early adopters of all these, green technologies, because it's a very rich country. And I don't think anybody would pretend that Norway wasn't rich through fossil fuel profits. So, yeah, there is that level of hypocrisy there that I find a bit hard. But like I was just saying before, fossil fuels are not going to go away entirely, and Norwegian fossil fuels are done better than most. If you look at the leakage and supply chain emissions, if you get it from a Norwegian project, your natural gas, say, it is far, far, far less emissions intensive than those same kinds of projects from many other countries. So, yeah, it's not really black and white in my mind, Norway, with their fossil fuels.
So most people in America wouldn't realize that Norway is a big oil country. It doesn't seem obvious. It seems cold. It seems like to be a lot of fishing. And our only connection to Norway is what we see in Walt Disney World at Epcot. They had a big exhibition there for a long time. I think they still do. But you go on this little log flume ride, and then you end up in this area where there's a big mural of offshore oil rigs. That was the thing. I mean, that's within the last 10 years, I'd say, that was still there. So there, obviously, Norway has a lot of energy in there, and I know it's a big point of contention by some of the countries, but it isn't like Norway's not looking at renewables. So they haven't shunned it, right? It seems like they're just trying to figure out a way to. Let me ask you: there's pumped hydro in Norway, right? And
they have hydro, and they've had hydro for a long time. like every other country with really great hydro resources, that made economic sense way before anybody cared about climate change. So that's, supplies the majority of their electricity. And so they've got a very clean electricity grid, and they export their oil and gas. Yeah,
Right.
but in terms of wind farms, I mean, it's they hate wind in Norway is the impression I get. You only hear about it in the news when there's some protest, or they're rescinding permission to build a wind farm because of community opposition, or something like that. So I don't get the impression
seems to be that way too.
Although Sweden has a lot of really good news stories for renewables, for wind and or for wind mostly, whereas only the negative ones about Norway seem to make it this far south anyway. So I don't get the impression that Norwegian people in general are really pro wind energy anyway, even though I know that they're usually, like, culturally, they're pretty environmentally aware. They get out of in nature a lot in Norway, which I think helps people care about protecting their environment. But I think that's also what's causing them to be, a lot of Norwegians to be anti-wind, because it affects the local environment. They've got a lot of beautiful fjords around. They don't necessarily want wind turbines in a lot of them.
Yeah, it makes sense. But everybody's making some change into their energy system. It isn't like Norway's alone, and Sweden isn't either. The United States is part of that same mix. So you get the same questions out of the United States. I don't think they're any different. What I do see is things are going to drastically change over the next 20 to 25 years. And whether they find a way to deal with it, they probably will. I mean, they'll find a way that's a Norwegian way. The Swedes will find a Swedish way. The Americans will find an American way. But I think we're all going to get there.
I don't think they're doing the right thing here by, it may be annoying for them to stare at other people and say, like, why aren't you doing it the same way we're doing it? Well, you guys have a lot more money than we do. So it's easier for you to make those adjustments.
Does help.
I mean, that's as simple as it is, right?
Does help.
So I think what you'll see there is, of course, this is the first offshore wind farm, the first big one there. Not the first, but the first big one. There will be more and more and more all up and down the Norwegian coast. Anytime you see, off the coast of Stavanger, you'll have one. You'll have every major city along that coastline. You'll have it, and part of it is driven by the not in my backyard, because the landscape is so beautiful. The good wind resource is also right at the top of the crest of that fjord.
Right.
So they're not going to want to install them there. I get it. It's also not that. Because they've come quite far in the transition, quite a lot further than most developed nations, they don't use as much electricity as some others do.
Yeah.
Right. So, and the population's fairly small in reality. So the transition will be easier for them.
I agree. And let Rosemary back in if she wants to go skiing there.
Now I'm not allowed in. That would be devastating to me. I do love it there, and I would say I don't want to see wind turbines in all those fjords either. I mean, I'd be happy for a few projects around, but the electricity grid is already so green. I don't see why you need to put them there. There's other places in Europe that you can put wind turbines, and everyone's connected. And everybody that's connected to Norway's hydro loves the security that provides for the the wind in the UK or elsewhere in Europe. So I think that they're playing a different role, and that's correct.
All right, Toyota of the automobile maker is developing portable hydrogen cartridges. I don't know if everybody's seen this on the web. I stumbled across it a couple of weeks ago, and I just thought it was interesting. And why is Toyota working on portable hydrogen? Well, I think they're trying to figure out the politics of energy in Japan and probably the United States. And if hydrogen is going to become the renewable energy of choice, that means you're going to have to get hydrogen almost everywhere. How are you going to do that? Well, Toyota has come up with these cartridges that are about a foot and a half long. Sorry, I'm going to speak in American terms. It weighs about 11 pounds. So what they envision is sort of you drop off this little cartridge at your local retailer, grocery store, Toyota dealer, and you pick up a new one that's full, and you take it back to the house or your apartment and use it for energy. They say that one of those cartridges will hold about enough electricity to power a microwave for 3 to 4 hours. Now, why they chose to power a microwave for 3 to 4 hours as their example doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because I don't know who is doing that, but okay. Maybe, Rosemary, you can run the calculations there to determine how much power this little cartridge has. But hydrogen, it's one of those low carbon fuels, and I think they're getting pushed by the government to try to figure out if they can adopt clean hydrogen. Is that the way of the future? Or, Joel, are you and I going to be cooking hot dogs on a hydrogen grill? Is that kind of where this is going? Because that's what those cartridges look like. Is they look like something like a small propane tank.
I guess you think about that. What is something in that same form factor used for today, and how well has that been adopted? So you have the little, what are they? We call them 2.5 pound tanks, right? The little tiny propane tanks. I use those for my camping stove. I think I use one in my mosquito machine.
Yeah, that's true.
Mosquitoes away. Sitting on the deck in the Midwest, and I think that's about it.
You don't have to get rid of that, Joel.
Wait a second.
Did you tell Rosemary? Did you tell Rosemary what the mosquito machine actually does? It attracts mosquitoes.
No, I'm not going to say
it.
So
it attracts mosquitoes by creating CO2, right? So mosquitoes find humans because we emit CO2. So mosquitoes are like little CO2 attractive insects, and that's how they find you. And a couple other things. But yeah, so you make these mosquito traps, you burn propane, it makes CO2, and the mosquitoes are attracted to it. There you go.
You will also attract every frog.
That's cool.
They will they'll sit right out in front of your mosquito capture
and wait
and eat all the mosquitoes as they come in. That's it. I would say the only other thing that I use those little propane cylinders for is my ice auger for ice fishing. So, with that being said, I don't see a lot of use for them, for this idea. Simply just because there's things that exist in that same form factor, different fuel, of course, but they're kind of a pain, and I don't really use them.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a really good system. But if Toyota is trying to introduce hydrogen to the consumer, what's one way to do it? Do it around things you use in the household. That way you build a comfort level with using hydrogen. Rosemary's shaking her head, and I would, as the engineer in me, agrees with you, Rosemary, because hydrogen is, unless they make a scent to it, hydrogen doesn't smell like anything. It's very light and it burns clear. You can't see it burn. So if it's burning, you can't tell it except for the heat that's coming off of it. It doesn't seem like a very consumer friendly fuel to use in an apartment.
No, there's so many problems with this. And I mean, so there's a lot of, I often complain about things people want to do with hydrogen, and
no, really.
And you might think that this is just more of that. My opinion on these cartridges is just more of that, but it's like they don't take any of the reason why people propose hydrogen for so many things is because there's a lot of, problems that are hard to solve, that even though hydrogen is inefficient and expensive, difficult to transport, and explosive, because the problem that they're trying to solve is hard enough, you would consider hydrogen. But here they've got a product trying to solve a bunch of easy problems that already have solutions, and they want to add in all those things. I just think that's incredible. And does anybody actually, I mean, I have a SodaStream machine, and we just had like a month or 2 months SodaStreamless because neither of us could be bothered to go change the cartridge. And we even recently bought a second cartridge so that, we could always have one swapped and ready to go. And of course, we just ran out both cartridges. So I don't think I'm abnormally lazy. My partner might suggest the opposite, but why would you do that if you could just connect something to electricity and just power it off that? And I mean, any of the things that they're saying you would do with this, it's still a small amount of energy in this cartridge. You can electrify any of those things, and in fact, they mostly are already electrified. Why would you go to something that bring something explosive and expensive and inconvenient into your home to replace something that is already perfectly well served by electricity. It's total nonsense. I just don't even know why you would bother even, mocking up a little plastic representation of what this hydrogen cartridge would look like, because it just shouldn't have made it out of that initial, like boardroom brainstorming session. It belongs on the whiteboard and never progress further.
I'll give you a similar comparison. Maybe it's an analogy. It's not an analogy, but it's close. Years ago, I was at the Indianapolis 500 Speedway. It's in the springtime. The big race is going to happen in a couple of weeks, and we're at this event for solar vehicles. Of all things, we had a solar car race that we were participating as a college. And at that place, they had a coal-fired car. Like it was a car that was fueled by coal. And I thought, that is just the bizarrest thing. Why does someone bring a coal-fired car to a solar-powered car race? And the reason is that coal was making an argument like, hey, we can be used in different forms, right? And I think this is the problem with hydrogen, is no one sees it as being a vehicle fuel. They see it as being the Hindenburg. So you have to find a way to bridge that gap between a cleaner fuel, I guess. And Rosemary, I know there's all problems with hydrogen. I get
it could be a cleaner fuel. I have to correct you there. It's not currently a cleaner fuel. It's currently a more dirty fuel, but it could be cleaner one day
it could be.
Yeah, when someday. We have more green hydrogen than we need to use for existing applications. Yeah, just had to add that.
We're going to fill our trunk full of these. Yes. We're going to fill our trunks, Joel, with these hydrogen cartridges so that we can power the microwave at the house. Seems like where it's going. Yeah.
Oh, the microwave example is just the best, because it's just like so detached from reality. I don't know how many of our viewers are fans of the movie Mean Girls. But there's a perfect analogy from there. I'm going to make it anyway. Maybe let's see if anyone comments, if anyone gets it.
It's too late now.
Toyota just needs to stop trying to make fetch happen with hydrogen. They're just trying to make hydrogen a thing for anything. This is just a step too far. I've gotten used to them pursuing it with passenger cars. That makes a million times more sense than these cartridges, and it doesn't make much sense. So, move on, hydrogen. Move on, Toyota, please. You're embarrassing yourselves.
So Rosemary votes no. Joel and I are going to abstain.
Yeah, and on Wednesdays we wear
exactly. Pink. I am wearing pink, kind of, but it's Tuesday here now currently.
Oh no! So next we have an interview with Nicholas Gaudern, CTO of PowerCurve, and he's going to describe a new invention. It's an update on Vortex generators called Dragon Scales. Really cool update. Improves the efficiency of Vortex generators by a good bit. So this is a really interesting interview. Stay tuned for Nicholas Gaudern of PowerCurve.
Lightning is an act of God, but lightning damage is not. Actually, it's very predictable and very preventable. Strike Tape is a lightning protection system upgrade for wind turbines made by WeatherGuard. It dramatically improves the effectiveness of the factory LPS, so you can stop worrying about lightning damage. Visit weatherguardwind.com to learn more, read a case study, and schedule a call today.
Well, Nicholas, welcome back to the podcast. Nicholas Gaudern, everybody, CTO of PowerCurve, and PowerCurve is a deep, intensive company focused on blade aerodynamics and blade improvements and blade add-ons to make your blades perform even better than what the OEM even envisioned. And Nicholas, welcome back on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alan. It's really nice to come back on. Looking forward to talking to you today about the exciting topics we've prepared together.
The one hot topic, which appeared on LinkedIn recently, is something called Dragon Scales. And you just kind of announce it to the world on LinkedIn, like, oh, Nicholas has been working on something really cool here, so let's hear about it.
Yeah, we kind of just kind of threw it out there. Yes.
What are dragon scales?
The dragon scales are a new type of vortex generator. So they are still a vortex generator. They still can be used in the ways we use vortex generators today, and I guess we'll get into that later. But the whole idea of the dragon scale is to make a better vortex generator. And by better, we mean one that still does the great job that VGs do. So they recover loss lift or they boost lift where you need it, but to do that with lower drag. So you will put the VGs on the blade, they'll still have that great beneficial effect, but the drag of the VG itself, the dragon scale, is lower than a standard VG. So that means on any given installation, that array will give you more AEP.
And we're going to put the image of dragon scales on the YouTube version of this podcast. So if you're listening to the audio version, you want to go to YouTube so you can actually see these dragon scales. But Nicholas, can you describe visually what dragon scales look like? Because they're different than standard VGs.
A standard VG, typically in the wind turbine world, is a triangular fin sticking up from the blade pretty much vertically. So it's just a triangle when you look at it from the side. You see a few of the different kinds of VGs out in the world, but the triangular VG is dominant. So with the dragon scale, it looks very different. Firstly, because there's not just one element to the vortex generator. We actually have multiple fins, if you want to call them multiple fins, making up the dragon scale VG. So I think in the image you can see on the YouTube version, we have 3 fins instead of one triangular fin. And if you actually look at those fins from above, you will see that they are not flat plates. So again, typically VGs, they're a flat plate, just very simple 2D thing. The dragon scale is fully 3-dimensional. So it actually looks like a number of little aerofoils stacked one behind the other. And you can imagine maybe if you took like a slice through an aircraft wing, for example, when it was taking off and the slats are extended, or if you were to take a slice through the front wing of a racing car, like an Indy car or something, then you would see this kind of cascade or multiple aerofoil configuration. So the dragon scale is taking a little bit of inspiration from that.
Yeah, it kind of looks like the sort of the leading edge or the front end of a Formula One car, a modern Formula One car, is what dragon scales look like. The existing VGs sort of look like something out of 1980s automobile racing, and there's a huge difference between those two, right?
Yeah, maybe even older. Yeah.
Yeah, right. It seems to be a lot more aerodynamic, and when you see it for the first time, you're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like a modern take on vortex generators. And we haven't had much change in vortex generators ever, really, on wind.
No. We really wanted to focus on that because, a VG is a great product. I think basically all of the major OEMs are using VGs. So they're very accepted within the industry. But that, I think, has made the development side of things very complacent. Everyone knows that VGs are useful and work, so it's just kind of there as a thing. It's kind of strange that no one's really come out of the box and said, well, a VG doesn't have to look like this. There are so many ways you can create a vortex. It doesn't have to be a triangular plate. So we just really push the boat out in terms of the imagination and the R&D effort to say, well, how can we do this with a modern twist? What can we use all of this advanced CFD that we now have at our fingertips? What can we use that for? Can we use it to iterate very quickly on lots of different designs? We've got some great new wind tunnels around the world. The Danish Technical University, DTU at Risu, has this wonderful new wind tunnel that the industry is using. And it allows you to test at very high Reynolds numbers on very big aerofoils. So we just kind of wanted to use all these tools that we had at our disposal. Brand new wind tunnels, high Reynolds number wind tunnels, lots of CPU power for CFD. Let's just bring all those things together and use it to make something that just pushes the boundary a little bit.
So these new dragon scales, are they different in terms of where they will be installed on the blade? Does that change chord-wise, like front to back on the blade, or is it basically in the same location that like we typically see?
It's a really good question. So the way we designed the Dragon Scale, in order to sort of be fair when we were making the comparisons in CFD and the wind tunnel, was to say the position's the same as today. So we have a triangular fin, we have a Dragon Scale fin, which does better, and the Dragon Scale does a lot better. But what this also means is we haven't gone into all the possibilities of how we can really take advantage of this extra performance from the Dragon Scale. So if we just were to replace an existing VG array with a Dragon Scale VG array, you'd get more AP. Easy, very, very straightforward. But what we can now dig into is if we shift the chordwise positions a bit, if we shift the spacing a little bit, if we shift the heights a little bit, maybe we can squeeze even more out of it. And that's going to be really exciting as the next phase of development to see, where can this take us?
But the only way you can do that is with the technology that you have, in that you do true CFD analysis on blades, and a lot of the blades that are designed and out in the field today have not had any CFD analysis done on them. I think it's kind of assumed that the OEMs are doing that, but they're typically not. They're using BEM to the analysis, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think if you look at any blade that's more than 5 or 6 years old, and actually probably even a lot more recent than that, no, they haven't had much, if any, CFD work done on them at all. And traditionally that was because it was very computationally expensive. And also BEM does work well. And if you're always just focusing on making the rotor bigger, then you're not trying to squeeze every last drop out of a rotor, because your focus as a business, someone like Vestas, GE, Siemens, is just getting the next product out. So I think, Power Curve, we have a very different objective, of course. We're not designing new blades and selling wind turbines. We're trying to optimize blades that already exist. So that means, we put a lot of focus on that CFD, that deep aerodynamic understanding, because it allows us to optimize rotors that may have not had all the attention they could have had spent on them. And that's fine. An OEM has a lot of different constraints to meet, whereas we're focused on just maxing out the performance within the envelope we have.
With VGs, there's a consistent question about adding any VG or any aerodynamic modification onto a blade does it affect the blade structure? Is it going to cause things to wear out sooner? I've seen that question pop up even more recently. Are there issues with VGs in terms of load and performance overall, lifetime-wise?
In the industry, there's been a few examples of some aerodynamic upgrades that maybe weren't thought through as well as they could have been. There's been some really kind of huge devices stuck onto blades. And although they've been shown to add performance, generally, if you're adding something that can attract a lot of load, like become a load-carrying structure in its own right, or that really changes the stiffness distribution of the blade, that can lead to some issues. But for the add-ons that PowerCurve provides, VGs, gurney flaps, serrations, they're very small, light pieces of plastic. So they're not in any way going to attract any load. They're not going to become a load carrying or a stressed component. And in order to really dig into that and how it impacts the turbine, we've actually gone through a really detailed validation study with UL, the certification body. So what we've done together with the UL is we have got them to assess all of our design methodology and go right back to basics. Everything we do in a design, CFD, CAD, FEA, aeroelastics, they've gone through with a fine-tooth comb every one of our processes, kind of like a vetting process, if you will. And then we've had to submit a lot of documentation talking about how our products are manufactured and how they're installed. And after all this assessment to the IEC standard, UL were able to issue us a statement saying that according to this assessment, the PowerCurve VG and gurney flap products can be considered load neutral. So what that means is if you put it on a wind turbine, those products are not going to damage the gearbox, the tower, the foundations. They're not going to have any adverse effects on those other components that isn't already considered within the certification margin or the safety margin of that machine.
Well, that's good. I mean, that's a really serious concern, and glad you guys answered that. So what a VG does on a blade, there's a sort of a little trick that a VG does, right? On a lot of airfoils, airplane airfoils, wind turbine blades, Formula One cars, there's a point in which you have separation for a variety of reasons, regardless of what causes separation. So the VGs basically take the air and shove it back down into the blade to make not so much more lip, but less drag? Or what's the aerodynamic description of what they do?
Kind of a bit of both. So I think I like to think of a vortex generator as kind of affecting the health of a boundary layer. So the boundary layer being that thin layer of flow that's very close to the surface of an airfoil. That's where all the action happens. That's where all the forces are interacting to give you flow separation, flow attachment, laminar turbulent transition, all these things that affect a turbine performance kind of all goes on in the boundary layer. So when that boundary layer is unhealthy, and it can be unhealthy for a number of reasons, such as the design of the airfoil giving a very strong adverse pressure gradient, or contamination on the leading edge, meaning that there's kind of more instabilities within the flow. All these things reduce the health of the boundary layer and mean that it's more likely to separate, detach from the surface before it reaches the trailing edge of the airfoil. And as soon as you have that boundary layer starting to peel away from the surface, then you lose lift and you get more drag. And typically they both come together. So that's bad for your wind turbine on 2 counts. Loss of lift and increase in drag will both reduce your AEP. So what a vortex generator does, as you were saying earlier, it kind of helps to stick that flow back down. So you can imagine that vortex that's being created behind the fin. It's got a very low pressure core that's helping to suck high energy fluid down to the surface. So you're bringing down this high energy fluid, you're giving that boundary layer a real kind of kick of energy, and that means that it can remain fully attached for much longer. So if you have your boundary layer more fully attached, then you'll get a recovery of any lift that you are losing, and you'll typically also reduce the drag because you haven't got this big thick boundary layer that's coming off the trailing edge.
So essentially the money you're making off a wind turbine, the power you're producing, is directly related to that boundary layer. And if that boundary layer gets turbulent or gets messy, you're losing money. Straight up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that word messy is quite relevant here because it kind of talks about the flow. The flow actually looks messy if you look at it in a wind tunnel, but also it kind of links to the things that cause it. And messy, a leading edge can look messy. It can be eroded. It can have dirt on it. It can have bugs or dust, whatever. That's messy. That gives you a messy flow, a messy boundary layer. And it does mean you lose AEP. So, vortex generators are a powerful tool because you can use them all over the blade. You can use them down in the root, and you can use them out towards the tip. And they're both the VGs are still doing the same job. They're creating their vortex, they're reducing separation. But the really interesting thing is what is causing that separation. So down in the root of the blade, it's typically because the aerofoils are very thick. They have strong adverse pressure gradients. The boundary layer can't stay attached. So it's a geometry thing. It's a shape thing. Whereas out at the tip, the boundary layer typically will be fully attached unless the blade gets dirty or eroded. So in those situations, the VG is there not because there's something fundamentally wrong with the design of the airfoil, but because the airfoil is being contaminated and the health of that boundary layer is decreased. So the VG is recovering losses when it's out towards the tip.
If a blade has leading edge erosion, and pretty much all blades have some level of leading edge erosion, that immediately makes the boundary layer messy, right? That just, there's no way to get around that. It's going to be messy. Do VGs correct that, or can they bring back or restore the losses that you would have had from leading edge erosion?
Yes.
Whoa. Okay.
That's a really important quality. So yes, when you have that erosion, that contamination, you lose performance, you lose lift. The VG recovers that lift back which means you get your AEP back.
So not only can you maintain your AEP, especially with the Dragon scales, the Dragon scales will give you more AEP than the original blade would, right?
Yes. So your Dragon scale VGs, let's say you had a blade with a regular VG layout, a standard VG layout, that will recover AEP. Your AEP will look better than the turbine did without the VGs. With the Dragon scales, we see the potential to get another 0.5% or so AEP. So let's say the blade today has a VG layout from PowerCurve, state of the art. It will recover you 2% AEP, 2% more AEP than you were before. Put the Dragon scale on, hopefully around the 2.5% AEP number.
Okay, those are big numbers. If you think about 1% can be a lot in terms of revenue, power production and revenue from a single wind turbine generator.
Yeah, the amount of energy that a turbine produces in a year is huge. So 1% can be really, really valuable. So we've seen a lot of very attractive business cases. If you can only add 0.5% AEP, that's still a good business case.
Right. So your return on investment is what typically? How many months normally?
We typically work in years, but not many years. So kind of 2 to 3 years is often the kind of return on investment we see with a lot of projects. It's really, as you can imagine, it's very heavily dependent on power price. And that varies massively around the world. So obviously the more you get paid for your energy, the quicker you'll pay back.
Well, with the recent prices jumping and electricity prices are jumping, at least in the United States and probably around the rest of the world, it should be the return on investment should be really, really good. I think the price of electricity in the near future is not going down, right? So is it easier? Can you install these Dragon scales on the? Do you have to bring the blades down to install them, or can you install them up tower?
Yeah, up tower is absolutely fine. So the actual installation process will be exactly the same as any other VG that we have today. So most of our installs that we do at PowerCurve, they're from rope access. So the process with the Dragon scale would be the same. We actually have an installation that's just happened in Denmark as the first trial installation of this product in the field. Looks great, looks really cool out on the blade. So we're looking forward to gather some more data from that, and then we'll be out there hunting for some launch customers that we can discuss, the potential of these products and what they could do for their fleet.
And there's a lot of repowering projects going on in the United States at the moment. Does this make sense if you're repowering to put on Dragon scales, especially since you have the blades on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that anytime you have a blade on the ground, you should absolutely assess the potential for upgrades. So it could be VGs, gurney flaps, serrations, lightning protection. Any of these upgrades that are going to improve the blade's performance and its robustness, you should look at doing it on the ground, because obviously it's a lot cheaper, it's a lot easier. So I would really encourage any operator who has a repowering project coming up or a reblading, whatever, give PowerCurve a call, and we can talk about the potential for upgrading that blade.
Definitely so. Yeah, if you're repowering a project in the next year or two, it makes a lot of sense to at least look at the Dragon scales as a potential money producer. That's what it is. It's just going to produce you more money, and that's the goal of running these wind turbines, is to have a profitable business, and it makes a lot of sense. So if anybody's interested, I think check out PowerCurve's website. You can reach out to Nicholas directly, I think, via LinkedIn. Just check out his LinkedIn page. You can reach him there. And it looks like a really cool technology.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alan. We're really proud of it. It's been in the works for the last year or two, and the wind tunnel results were just amazing. We were so pleased with what we saw. So yeah, looking forward to the next stage of the product development.
Yeah, we're looking forward to seeing Dragon scales on more wind turbines. It's going to be a really cool advancement for wind turbine blades. And Nicholas, I really appreciate your time today, and really glad to have you back on the program. We'll have you back on in the future. Thanks so much.
Great to talk to you, Alan. Thanks a lot.
That's going to do it for this week's Uptime Wind Energy Podcast. Thanks for listening. Please take a moment and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast platform. Be sure to subscribe in the show notes below to Uptime Tech News, our weekly newsletter, as well as Rosemary's YouTube channel, Engineering with Rosie. And we'll see you next week on the Uptime Wind Energy Podcast.